On this board, we're talking about TRID. What does TRID stand for? TRID stands for TILA-RESPA Integrated Disclosure Rule. What is the history of TRID? The history is prior to October 3rd, 2015, borrowers received 2 cost-related disclosure forms at the time of application and potentially 2 more similar forms at the time of closing. The similar forms contained overlapping information and were confusing for consumers to understand. In response to these problems, the Dodd-Frank Act required the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau to combine a few of the disclosures required by RESPA and TILA in order to make them easier to understand and to cut back on some of the excessive paperwork. What is the purpose of TILA? The purpose is to protect the borrowers. That there's the overall purpose, right? To protect the borrowers. But how? How do they protect the borrowers? They protect the borrowers by dictating what information mortgage lenders need to provide to borrowers and when they must provide it, and by regulating what fees lenders can charge and how these fees can change. Therefore, TRID helps borrowers to understand their options and to become more informed shoppers and to avoid surprises. You see, in the past, lenders were like doing a lot of tricky stuff where like initially they would, offer a certain set of terms, and then when it came time to actually close the loan, they changed the terms up, right? It was like a switch and bait type of stuff, right? That some of these lenders were doing, right? And so the government has stepped in and is like, hey, look, you can't be doing all this tricky stuff, right? We have to protect the borrowers, right? And we have to make sure that the borrowers really understand clearly. We have to make sure that the borrowers clearly understand what their options are so that the borrowers can be more informed shoppers and so that the borrowers can avoid surprises. We can't be surprising these borrowers with these, fees at the last minute and stuff, right? So TRID has stepped in to protect the borrowers. Now, what are the 2 major forms of TRID? The 2 major forms. What are the 2 major forms of TRID? 2 major forms are the LE and the CD. The LE, which means the loan estimate, and the CD, which means the closing disclosure. Now, what is the LE? What is the loan estimate? Well, the loan estimate is an estimation of the principal, interest rates, closing costs, and mortgage features of the loan. Now, when must the LE be given, right? Well, the lender is required to either give or mail the loan estimate to the borrower no later than 3 business days after taking the borrower's application and no later than 7 business days prior to closing of the loan. Now, I mentioned about the application, right? I mentioned that, right, the lender is required to either give or mail the loan estimate to the borrower no later than 3 business days after taking the borrower's application. Now, question, when is an application considered to be received, right? Because when after an application is received, that starts the time clock regarding this thing about how, the lender has to give the borrower the loan estimate, right? No later than 3 business days after taking the borrower's application. So when exactly is an application considered to be received? Well, here's the thing. An application is considered to have been received when the lender has obtained these 6 pieces of information. Number 1, the name. Number 2, the income. Number 3, the social security number. Number 4, the property address. Number 5, the estimated value of property. And number 6, the loan amount. So now we talked about the LE. Now let's talk about the CD, the closing disclosure. What is the closing disclosure? What is the CD? Well, the CD, the closing disclosure, is the actual cost information at the time of closing of the loan. It's the actual cost. So here's the thing, we have the LE and we have the CD. Now, ideally, they should be the same, but of course, often they're not, right? Now, here's the thing. When we compare the closing disclosure to the loan estimate, right? Often we'll see differences, right? And if depending on what those differences are, will determine whether or not those differences are acceptable or not, right? And that's where we talk about tolerances, all right? So there's a zero tolerance, meaning a zero tolerance means that it's not acceptable for there to be a difference between the loan estimate and the closing disclosure regarding certain costs, right? So certain costs, certain fees have a zero tolerance, meaning they cannot change, right? Any change is unacceptable, right? Well, I'll say it cannot, like the cost for in the closing disclosure cannot be more than what was disclosed in the loan estimate, right? So here are the fees that have a zero tolerance, right? Number 1, fees paid to the lender, mortgage broker, or an affiliate of either taking, underwriting, and processing the application. Number 2, origination fees. Number 3, cost of third-party services that the borrower is not allowed to shop for. Typically, the appraisal fee, right? The credit report fee, tax service fee, flood certifications fee, etc. And number 4, transfer taxes. So these types of fees, there's a zero tolerance, meaning the fees that are in these fees that are in the closing disclosure cannot be any more than what was disclosed in the loan estimate, right? Regarding those particular fees. Now, there's another category called the 10% tolerance category, right? What is the 10% tolerance category? Well, number 1, keep in mind, when I say 10% tolerance, I mean cumulative, all right? So although any one of these charges can exceed charges listed on the LE by any amount, the final amount, the aggregate, the cumulative, right? The final amount, the aggregate for these third-party charges cannot exceed the amount disclosed on the LE by more than 10%. And what are these charges? Number 1, recording fees. Number 2, fees to third-party services, fees to third-party service providers that the borrower is allowed to shop for, typically title services, termite inspections, etc. If the borrower elects to use a provider listed on the lender's recommended provider list. And number 3, government recording fees. Now, there's a third category called no tolerance requirement at all, right? So in this third category, there is no tolerance requirement, meaning for these types of fees, what's listed in the closing disclosure can be any number, it can be any difference, you know what I'm saying? And it'll be accepted, right? So what are the fees that have no tolerance requirement? Well, number 1, fees for services that the owners choose for themselves. If they don't choose from the lender's list. Remember in the 10% tolerance category, we talked about how, fees to third-party service providers that the borrower is allowed to shop for if the borrower elects to use the provider listed on the lender's recommended provider list, okay? So if the borrower is choosing one of the service providers that is on the lender's list of recommended providers, right? Then that would fall under 10% tolerance. But in this situation, if the borrower is choosing for themselves a service, right, that is not on the lender's list, then there's no tolerance requirement for that expense, for that cost. All right. Number two, fees that are paid per diem, right? Meaning for example, prepaid mortgage interest. And number three, homeowners insurance, flood insurance, property taxes, these insurance and taxes that are due at closing, right? No tolerance requirement. Now, what is the exception to the TRID rule? Like, what are the mortgage loans that TRID does not apply to? Well, the exception is this: the TRID rule does not apply to the following types of mortgage loans. Number one, HELOCs. And what is a HELOC? What is a HELOC? Home equity line of credit, right? TRID does not apply to HELOCs. So number one, it does not apply to HELOCs. Number two, reverse mortgages. Number three, mortgages for mobile homes not secured by real estate. Number four, loans from anyone who funds no more than 5 loans in a calendar year. Typically, these are sellers assisting in financing properties that they are selling, right? And now, what are the record retention requirements regarding these two major forms, the loan estimate and the closing disclosure? Like, how long must the lender, retain these records, right? Well, for the LE, the loan estimate is 3 years. 3 years for the LE. And for the CD, the closing disclosure, it's 5 years. 5 years. So TRID, what is TRID? TILA-RESPA Integrated Disclosure Rule, right? And it's all about protecting the borrower, It's all about helping the borrower, to understand their options, to become more informed shoppers, and to avoid surprises, So if you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the chat section below, and I'll see you next time on the next episode. Now, by the way, this is just an overview, right? All right, there's a lot more to TRID, right, that you need to know, especially if you're studying to become a mortgage loan originator. There's a whole lot more details about TRID that you need to know and you need to master. And I highly recommend a particular exam prep course called Affinity. And the particular course that I'm in, and it's been just a huge blessing, it's called the Mastery course. If you Google Affinity, I'm sure you can find it. If you Google like Affinity mortgage training, I'm sure it'll come up because it's very popular, and I highly recommend it. So these videos are great. These summaries are great, but if you're studying for the MLO exam, you need much more than just this. You need a real intensive, detailed exam prep course, and the Affinity Mastery course is the best. It will get you prepared for the MLO exam. All right. Take care, and I'll see you next time on the next video.